And we are live. And am I echoing?
Not yet.
No echoing. All right. I think the Jinx was talking about technical things, so I'm going to try it again. And my name's Tara DePort, and I'm founder and executive director of the Human Impacts Institute. And this is our 4th online Impacts Hour. And I'm really excited to have 2 wonderful guests today. We're going to continue conversations around climate change communications and really how we can address climate change in very different ways. And I have John Wick with me today and Reinhard. How do I say your last name, Reinhard?
Hohlwein.
Hohlwein.
Yeah.
And they're 2 wonderful experts in both land use management and waste management practices, as well as certainly around climate change issues. And I'm excited today to help facilitate the conversation. But first, I'm going to pass it over to you, Reinhart, to give an introduction to both your work and to John's work.
Right. Well, thanks, Tara. Appreciate the time, and it's good to finally get on. I work in California for the state at the agency that manages waste materials, but we're in the process of reinventing how we deal with materials, which is to say it isn't waste anymore. We're going to try and find new ways to frame all this material because we can't keep creating the amount of materials and have the impacts that they have worldwide. And that's part of what we're doing here in the state. It's going on all over the world. And in that capacity, I met John a few years ago in Marin County. I was very grateful for that moment and still am. And he's turned out to be an incredible inspiration. And what John does is he's managing his ranch and his soils and his grasslands to maximize the photosynthetic capacity of that particular acreage so that it will be more functional and bring carbon out of the air and put it into the ground in a process called carbon sequestration, which at scale could be very impressive as a response to the problems that we have. And what's really different about John's work is that it's within living systems. It's not an invention. It's not a technological fix. This is using and working with and being complementary with the living systems that we already have that have been so functional for so many millennia that they're pretty much time tested. So we can rely on those. What we need to do is be artistic with those. That's what John's doing. And that's what's exciting about the work is that it's a climate solution set that is within living systems, and it doesn't rely on some kind of another technological turn in the road. We do have some really significant tools available at hand to help us divine some serious response to the challenges of GHG concentration, greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. So John's project is the Marin Carbon Project. He also understands that the public and policymakers need to understand the carbon cycle. So he has the Carbon Cycle Institute, which has a policy arm and some other things. I could let him describe that a lot better. And that's how I got to meet John. And then we continue to work together along with so many different people. John's done such an incredible job. A vast array of people are helping him out as they get excited about the solutions that John's about to talk about. So without any further ado, John Wick from Marin County and Palo Alto right now.
Thank you. Well, good morning or good afternoon or good day. A couple things. I as a rancher, had made some very arrogant and naive assumptions about my relationship to those managed natural systems, and in doing so caused a lot of problems at a landscape scale. And in 2003, my wife and I had the good fortune of meeting a PhD rangeland ecologist, Dr. Jeffrey Creek. And it was Jeff's suggestion that we did a lot of reading, which we did, and we started to gain insight into these systems. And Jeff also had this amazing philosophy, and it was to back away from the system and observe it, and then think about very simple actions that might influence the direction of the system that you find desirable. And in order for that to work, you have to declare what your desired outcome or management objectives are. And so that was a challenge for us. We decided to create ground nesting bird habitat and native ecosystem function. And in support of that goal, Jeff's suggestion was to reintroduce grazing as a tool We did not want to own animals or a herd of animals. So we were able to arrange borrowing a large herd, 250 cattle, bring them into our system just at the time of year when they might have the most beneficial disruption of what was going on. And in our case, we were trying to shift the species composition from the exotics, the annual oats, and in our case, a lot of weeds that had taken over the landscape over the last decade or so. So by introducing a grazing disruption intentionally, just at the time of year when the exotic plants were trying to produce seeds, we removed them from the system and then stood back and watched to see if by chance there might be some native species that would thrive because of that new condition. And it worked. And within a few short years, actually, we started to establish whole native ecosystem. These are plant communities, not just single species. So this was more and more exciting to Dr. Creek, who is, as a systems thinker, was trying to understand what the theoretical framework upon which all this was happening. And Jeff ultimately correctly identified that carbon was the thing we were managing for. And that inspired the Marin Carbon Project. And our idea there was, if we put carbon at the center of our management objectives and the flow of carbon in and out of these systems, that might be a good thing. And in our case, it was certainly, all the evidence was it was good. And so there's a couple of fundamental principles that I became familiar with. And some elements of those principles are important. First of all, there's a big difference between annual and perennial grasses. I had never thought of this, but in becoming familiar with the difference in the behavior of the plants, it turns out that the deeper rooted perennial plants potentially transform atmospheric carbon into plant tissue, and in that process, more and more and more of that atmospheric carbon can end up in a form in the soil system that could be beneficial if taken to scale. And so through a series of relationships, we were able to bring in some pretty hardcore science into our system. And part of what I'd like to share with you now is the way that grass transforms carbon into soil carbon. So I have a graphic presentation that I'll cue up here. And I think I was supposed to turn on a screen share. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
And
I'm still here. I just put our logo on there. so you don't have to look at me listening to you. But if you need help with the screen share, let me know.
Did that come up?
It did, yep.
Good, okay.
And before you get started on that, would you mind just doing a quick touch for some people who might be joining, watching this conversation later, of the kind of connection between managing soil and how that could connect to climate change? Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think my presentation will address that pretty squarely. So
wonderful.
Let's go to it. So in terms of soil, let's start with soil, and I'll represent that here. Basically, what we have is the soil profile here. And in our case, what we're interested in doing is managing for grass plants. And so what we see above the ground is, most of us are familiar with grass. They're little green vegetative structures. But what we're becoming more and more interested in is what's happening below ground in the root systems. And so as I described, in our objective, we thought we were potentially increasing soil carbon through our management of these grass systems. And so if you think of soil carbon and the pathways where atmospheric CO2 could become soil carbon, Dr. Creek's thinking was that by shifting our species composition towards the deeper rooted native perennials, we would be transforming atmospheric carbon photosynthetically into durable soil carbon. And we were seeing more and more evidence that that was happening. And so what I wanted to just explore a little bit with you is the process that happens. We're all familiar with this phenomenon that green plants produce oxygen and moisture to the atmosphere, and that's a good thing. And they do this by, during photosynthesis, on the bottom of all green leaf plants, on the bottom of the leaves are these openings called stomata. And when the stomata open to release the oxygen and moisture, at that moment, atmospheric CO2, which is a gas under pressure, fills the leaf. Now we have a leaf full of carbon, and then under the sun's energy, plants pull in soil moisture and soil nutrients. This is the waste product of microbes in the soil. It's a T. So through the roots, plants pull in soil moisture, soil nutrients. The leaf is full of carbon, and under the sun's energy through photosynthesis, the plant produces sugar. Sugars are carbohydrates. And until this project, I had never thought about it before, but carbohydrates, C6H12O6, all of the carbon in carbohydrates comes from the air by this process. Had you asked me before, I would have suggested that perhaps the carbon came in through the roots like the moisture does, but it's the opposite, and that's what our work has been focusing on. So here we have a process, a natural process occurring across the planet where atmospheric carbon dioxide under the sun's energy is transformed into carbohydrates. And all of the carbon in carbohydrates was in the air, and then combined with soil moisture and nutrients, we create sugars, starches, cellulose, which are the products of agriculture. And through the production of food, fuel, fiber, and flora, perhaps there's a way in those processes that we could increase soil carbon. That's what we thought we were seeing. So we reached out to UC Berkeley and met a soil biogeochemist, Dr. Wendy Silver. Dr. Silver is very familiar with the soil system, and our question that we asked her was, is my grazing management increasing soil carbon? And Dr. Silver, to our surprise, said, I doubt it. And I doubt we could measure it because changes in such a vast pool would be very hard to detect. But Dr. Creek was seeing evidence that the type of plants that were appearing now were water-loving plants, which suggested to him that we were increasing soil carbon because one of the co-benefits of increased soil carbon is increased soil water holding capacity. Dr. Silver explained to us that soil carbon is actually made up of different forms of carbon, and depending on what form the carbon is in, the carbon resides in the soil at different rates. Most soil carbon is actually labile carbon. Most soil carbon is in the plant tissues, it's in microbes, it's in living organisms. So this labile carbon is very temporary. It will last in the soil for minutes to months and will cycle back up to the atmosphere as CO2. So during soil processes, microbes are eating plant tissues and they're eating each other. And in that process, that carbon gets respired back as CO2. That's a carbon cycle. So we see carbon coming in from the air, into the leaves, into the soil, into plant tissue. And then another pathway that carbon enters the soil in addition to the plant tissues is around all of the roots. Plants actually exude or discharge a tremendous amount of sugar into the soil system to feed these microbes who live all around the root zones. These organisms act as the digestive tract and the immune system for plants. So now we see atmospheric carbon becoming plant tissue, becoming food for microbes, and also there's a association with fungus, mycorrhizal fungi. Plant exchange sugar for nutrients. So we have plant tissue, bodies of microbes, mycorrhizal fungi, and then there's this natural accumulation of tissue and manures and bodies on soil systems. And over time, different soil systems have developed different mechanisms where this carbon and nitrogen is pulled down into the soil to start this life process. Additionally, so there's 4 pathways where atmospheric carbon can enter the soil system. Now the form it's in the system determines how long it will reside in there. Most soil carbon is labile. It will cycle through quite rapidly, minutes to months. However, in those processes, in the soil, there are conditions where this labile carbon, the free carbon in the system, which is sticky, can start to accumulate and be collected. And mycorrhizal fungi, the hyphae, can actually start to wrap these clusters of soil carbon, creating soil beds. This is soil structure, and this is a good thing. And this is physically protected. Now this carbon is sticky and sticking to pieces of soil structure, and we create the occluded light fraction carbon. This is interesting carbon because the occluded light fraction carbon actually can last for decades. Dr. Silver did not think we were increasing the occluded light fraction, but rather just cycling labile carbon through. And then just to fill out the description, there's another form of carbon, and this can happen on the surface of the soil or a meter deep. Same thing with this is free carbon that is the result of these processes. This is sticky. It can be the waste product or the dead body of a microbe, and it can become chemically bonded inside a crack in a clay particle, for instance. This is heavy fraction carbon, and this carbon can actually last for millennia unless we plow. And plowing actually turns out to be the event that humans started 12,000 years ago that has actually been, in some regards, mining this fossil carbon, these two forms, the occluded light fraction and the heavy fraction carbon. Through tillage, when we break the soil structure, microbes can gain access to these protected forms of carbon. They eat it. They produce plant available nutrients, which is a good thing. We see a biomass response and an increase of plant production, but we're doing that at the cost of carbon reserves in the soil. So our question to Dr. Silver is, are grazing management increasing durable soil carbon? She said, I doubt it, and I doubt we could measure it. Dr. Creek was quite confident, however, that we were increasing this more durable carbon. So we agreed to do some experiments and test this idea. And in order to do that, we needed to know what our baseline carbon levels were in these grazed systems. So Dr. Silver's background was tropical forest systems, and this was new to her. So she did some reading, and it turns out that grass grows in grasslands. Grass co-evolved with grazing animals. So grass actually requires the removal of the surplus biomass by herbivory. And when you don't graze, you actually get thatch and weeds and other problems like that. So we have a plant that requires grazing. Grass grows in grasslands. Grasslands are found in rangeland systems globally. Rangeland systems are mostly grass, some brush, some trees. And it turns out that grazed rangeland systems are the single largest cover type on Earth, 3.5 billion hectares. It's a very important system for humans. We rely a lot on grazed animals for fiber and milk and meat production. And so now, looking scientifically at one of the largest managed systems on Earth, the potential for changes in management to result in shifting of carbon from the air through photosynthesis into the soil becomes important. So Dr. Silver is getting a little more interested, but still confident that what we're doing isn't increasing the more durable forms of carbon. At most, we're exciting the system through our grazing management and seeing a biomass response, but not actually doing a climate beneficial activity. Dr. Creek, however, thought we were, so this is great. We have two scientists with different positions on this. So we agreed to do a soil survey of our county in Marin, which is north of San Francisco, to determine what the typical baseline carbon levels were in these two more recalcitrant fractions. So through soil chemistry and soil chemistry processes, we're able to isolate the different forms that the carbon's in. So initiating a soil survey in 2008 from January to May, we gained access to 35 dairies and beef operations and looked at the soil underneath their pastures. And the net result of that survey, we found something that surprised even Dr. Silver. There was a range of soil carbon from 30 to 150 tons of carbon per hectare. Now that we're dealing with scientists, the unit of measure they use for land areas is hectares, which is just under 2.5 acres. This is a big spread and surprised Dr. Silver even. She wanted to know what had happened on these high carbon sites. How is it that those same systems with similar management, similar soil, similar climate had significantly increased carbon levels? Turns out that those systems had been spraying or had sprayed wet dairy manure on top of the soil to dispose of it. This was the first biogeochemical analysis of that managed system. These are very low value lands, and no one would typically spend the kind of resources to do this high resolution scientific measurement. But what we found was very important. This high carbon soil was then sent to the laboratory to have it carbon dated. And this was a game changer for all of us. It turns out that in 1996, near Australia, there was a test of a nuclear device that released a very discrete carbon isotope into the atmosphere globally. We found massive quantities of 10-year-old carbon, a meter deep, in Marin County soils in the two more recalcitrant fractions. This was really important. So we saw additional carbon in a relatively permanent form that was very fresh. Up until that moment, the conventional wisdom was that it took 1,000 years to build soil. We now had statistically significant measurements of increased carbon in a durable form from a management practice, a topical application of an organic amendment. However, we know that the emissions associated with dairy lagoons and the pulse of nitrogen or nitrous oxide emissions from that manure being applied to soils would offset any possible carbon benefits. And so it was our challenge to try and do this experiment replicating those conditions without the emissions. And so after a lot of conversations, what we decided to do was to look at compost. And so on a block of plots on our ranch and up in the Sierras, we were able to organize a research project to look at grazed systems. I'll shift my screen here a little bit over. And so the idea here was to take a look at compost as a treatment to mimic the effect that we saw from the manure. So on blocks of plots, these are randomly assigned treatment and control plots on our ranch. So we have a treatment plot and a control plot. We put 1/2 inch of compost as an experiment to see if we could induce the same effect. These are 25 by 65 meter plots. They're randomly assigned. There's a 5-meter buffer, and we fully instrumented them. We put probes to 30 centimeters measuring temperature and moisture. And prior to any treatment, we did bulk density pits. We knew the soil profile. We did corings in 9 locations per plot to 1 meter deep in 4 different depths. And we knew everything about the biogeochemical properties of the system. Dr. Val Evner from UC Davis and Becca Riles, the PhD candidate on the job, did a vegetation assessment. They knew what plants, how many, and where they were. And then we found a locally available certified organic green waste compost as a medium to experiment with. And we chose 1/2 inch as the thickness that we wanted to apply, hoping to mimic what we saw the manure had done. We chose a 1/2 inch because we wanted enough material that we thought we could see it in the soil system, but not too much to cover the growth crowns of the plants. This was not an agronomic rate. This was pure research. And so on December 8th of 2008, on my system with 3 blocks of plots, and up in the Sierras on December 12th, we put 1/2 inch of compost to see if we could measure results of soil carbon increases. And by May of the following year, we both grazed our systems, and what we found amazed everyone. We found that the increased carbon, well, first of all, I'll start with the vegetation. By measuring the production to begin with, what we measured was average of 50% increase of grass production of what turns out to be a higher nutritious, higher protein, more nutritious grass. Because we had the soil probes in the system, we were able to measure 26,000 liters more water per hectare than the control plot. And for our purposes, with the carbon, oh, I'm sorry, I made a little mistake there. So in terms of the carbon, the increase that we measured just in the 2 occluded light fraction and heavy fractions, we measured basically a ton of carbon molecules that had come in per hectare within 5 months. So this worked. We basically saw the photosynthetic transformation of atmospheric carbon into a durable form in the soil, deep in the soil, within 5 months. And some very exciting results here. The important thing was that the next year, without any further compost, we measured another 2,000 pounds of carbon coming in. And then again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. So for 5 years, from a single application of compost, we measured a ton of carbon entering the system on its own through photosynthesis every year. And this is a very exciting thing, but it begs all kinds of questions, for me at least. And one of them is there enough compost? And this is where I started to work with Reinhart and explore that question. And so the idea is, if we take this idea to scale, would there be enough compost? Would there be enough landowner participation? And so that's been a whole exploration on itself. There's another thing I wanted to point out back here on this increased carbon levels. This data set was provided to Dr. Bill Parton at Colorado State University, who's the author of the Descent and Century model. And Dr. Parton took our data and did over 1,000 model runs with this kind of performance within the soil system. And he determined that that phenomenon from that single application of compost would continue sequestering atmospheric carbon for 30 to 100 years. So this is a very exciting idea. And this now gets to Dr. Creek's idea of states and transitions and the state change that we've initiated by bumping the system once with a carbon and energy. And from that point forward, the system is acting differently. It's on its own now become a carbon transformation process that's removing more and more and more carbon from the atmosphere. So at that point, I wondered if you had any questions or wanted me to go in any particular direction.
That's a great start to the background on this information, and it's so beautiful to hear the story. The point that's really worth remarking on is that this is a systems stimulation. It's as John calls it, it's a state change. What's really also, I haven't heard him use the phrase yet, but it's replicable, scalable, and broadly applicable, meaning that this can be done in so many different places across the world at scale if we can get the procedures under the management of it clarified, and that we get enough materials, as John was saying. So is there enough compost? That's still a significant question, but as an example, we have serious changes in the Sierra Nevada tree form these days because of the drought. That material is all available to be harvested and composted if we could do it. It's an example of someplace we could go that we didn't see as a normal waste material. But going back to the standard materials that we pass through our hands, we can do a much better job of managing all kinds of different materials and reframing how their initial impacts can come back and help us a second time, not just as a product or as a process, but as part of an integrated management philosophy about holistic management of materials. So that includes green waste, and that includes food waste, and that includes all kinds of other things, including sludges and agricultural waste, and then the silvicultural waste associated with forestry. So there are a significant amount of materials that need to be processed, and how we do that going forward is part of the challenge. And then there's also economic challenges. We'll be talking about that at a workshop later today. John can continue to enlighten us on what happens with the carbon after it gets permanentized, shall we say?
Okay.
After it gets captured. So just
there are a couple things.
And before, can I actually pose a question before you get to that?
Yeah.
Because I think some people that will watch this later might not have the technical background or remember their, ecosystem science, or have ever had them. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if we were to, in terms of communications and really simplifying, kind of the model of what was happening before and the potential of where we could go with this, can you give us kind of for the elevator pitch, as it were, or the, how you would explain this, not using as much of the scientific component, but a kind of a very simplified summary of what you just talked about?
Yeah, so let's go to scale. It's a question of scale. So at the landscape scale on a ranch, we've shown that a management practice can transform atmospheric carbon into durable soil carbon. And the measurements, the co-benefits that we've measured are significant. Each one of the benefits is worth doing it. The increased water holding capacity, 26,000 liters per hectare. That's a huge amount of water. The increased forage production of a more nutritious product, that's wonderful. So there's two good reasons right there. Also, by taking the manures and turning them into compost rather than manure, there's an emission reduction or emission elimination in that as well, which touches on a very important idea. And if you're familiar with the International Panel on Climate Change 5th assessment, a very important thing was declared in that last assessment, and that is that emission reduction will no longer help avoid the runaway climate crisis. We're past the tipping point of just solving it by emission reductions. The next sentence in that proclamation is, we must develop an ongoing strategy of atmospheric carbon removal. And that is what I've just described to you. So we've discovered a way to perform agriculture to produce the material solutions for human needs in terms of food, fuel, fiber, and flora that can all actually result in more carbon being removed and tucked safely into the soil where it continues to perform good work. So more carbon is removed from the atmosphere and ends up in the soil than is re-released through the enjoyment of the products produced in those systems. This is becoming pretty cool because the more we do of this, the more resources we have to do more of it. This is life. This is a good thing. So these living systems, if we can manage for good things to happen, for organisms to thrive, the beneficial ones, by promoting the basic healthy soil conditions where we keep living roots in the soil, we don't till, we keep the soil covered, and we promote diversity. By managing for those three objectives, it turns out we can produce more, and the things we do produce are better. So managing for healthy soil seems like a very good approach to agriculture, and it is replicable, scalable, and broadly applicable. But we need to take up from the field scale and look at the global system. And a way I'd like to describe that is looking at atmospheric carbon. And the important thing about atmospheric carbon is it's one form of carbon. And in fact, there's a finite amount of carbon on Earth, and where that carbon is and what form it's in is interesting to us. And the problem right now is through our last 12,000 years, and certainly the last 200 years, our enjoyment of carbon has resulted in more and more and more of it ending up in the atmosphere as atmospheric carbon. We just crossed the threshold of 400 parts per million, which is it was several months ago, but now we're squarely above 400 parts per million on the planet. Historically, there have been other thresholds. There was 350 parts, 300, 250, and 200. So if we constrain this discussion to those levels, historically, up until 12,000 years ago, atmospheric carbon basically ranged, and it went up and down seasonally and over longer time periods, between 190 and 290 parts per million. And then 12,000 years ago, when we started tillage, atmospheric carbon for the first time started going up more and more and more and more, and quite rapidly more recently. When I look at that pattern, I wonder, well, where did that carbon come from and go to? It turns out that these different forms that carbon is, we have carbon in the atmosphere as atmospheric CO2, plants and vegetation and all living things, actually the biosphere carbon is in the form of carbohydrates. And in the soil system, soil carbon, we see the different fractions that the carbon takes there. And then fossil carbon, which after deep time, the soil carbon and the biomass become fossil carbon. So we have 5 pools, the 5th one being the oceans. But for our conversation, we'll look at the terrestrial system. So we have atmospheric carbon, biosphere carbon, soil carbon, and fossil carbon. It turns out that the Earth and the sun get closer and go further apart every 100,000 years. So there's a cooling and a warming. And so as the planet warms, vegetation increases. And so that vegetation, basically the increase of that comes out of the atmospheric carbon pool. So it's an inverse relationship. And then as the planet cools, plants die, carbon goes back to the atmosphere. So you can see this pattern. Then 12,000 years ago, with our increased human population learning agriculture, we learned to increase biomass production, but there's this greater amount of carbon entering the atmosphere than we can account for in the biomass. Turns out that our tillage practices, when we first started tilling and mining fossil carbon, we're depleting that carbon pool. And then 200 years ago, we discovered coal and other forms of high energy carbon, and we've been depleting them. So these two forms of carbon here, the fossil carbon and the soil carbon, is where the additional atmospheric carbon came through the production of biomass. So what we've discovered here is that there's a way to even further increase biomass production, but in a new way that restores carbon to the soil that came from the atmosphere. And by doing this, we can actually achieve the 350 parts per million that we want to. And of course, we do need to stop emissions from fossil carbon, but we can easily replace that with other forms. And this is actually our opportunity right now. How can we make an informed transition to renewable energies and start recycling all of the resources that are under human management? And that's a lot of the work that Reinhart is involved with. But I think this is a very exciting idea here, that we can actually increase the production of plant-based solutions for material cultural needs, food, fuel, fiber, and flora, in ways that restore balance to the carbon cycle, increase water holding capacity of soil systems, produce safe fibers, healthy foods, renewable fuels, and very interesting flora, which is lumber, pigments, medicines, and things of that nature. So there are several projects that have kind of sprung up from this. The Fiber Shed project in particular is one of the things I'm most excited about. And the idea is that we could produce more and more and more textiles derived from carbon farms, which is what we're describing here. And these carbon farms are now being organized around the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a part of the USDA. The Natural Resource Conservation Service gets Farm Bill funding to the soil through practices. And the team at the NRCS has identified 30-something practices that are known to be soil, carbon, and climate beneficial. And so with the team at Colorado State, that suite of climate beneficial agricultural practices has now been organized into what is called the Comet Planner, which is an online tool, and it's a new agricultural user interface into the DayCent model. And it quickly helps land managers understand that changes in their management by adopting these climate beneficial practices can result in healthier agricultural systems. And this is also a way for our society to recognize the importance of agriculture through the Farm Bill subsidies. And so the pathway for Farm Bill funding to end up on the ground is through the NRCS, and we've identified a suite of NRCS practices known to be climate beneficial. So it's a pretty exciting idea that the shift in agriculture towards climate beneficial practices could actually end up in result in balancing Earth's climate and the carbon cycle.
Superb. So how about if we take one word that he was using and extrapolate on that? We've been enjoying carbon for a long time. It's a really interesting way of looking at it. I find that very charming. What's also true is that we've been misunderstanding it, and that misunderstanding has grown greatly as the carbon dioxide fraction of greenhouse gases has become the main issue about climate change, and people either want to understand that, or they want to turn away from it, or they would prefer to ignore it. We can't afford to ignore it. We're made of carbon and water, among other things, and we need to understand and embrace the carbon cycle. That's what carbon cycle literacy is about. So part of what you do, Tara, is to educate the public, and part of what we're doing is to try and help provide some fundamental restructuring and appreciation for not only carbon itself, but the carbon cycle. So even though it's a little bit technical, it is part of what people do need to appreciate, is that carbon does move from these different pools, from the atmosphere into the terrestrial mode, and from the atmosphere into the ocean, which is also providing a tremendous buffer for the excess carbon that we've been pumping into the atmosphere. So going back to what John's proposing is a scalable response through the photosynthetic apparatus of the planet to try and guide the process of carbon use and carbon enjoyment, if you will, rather than to constantly just abuse it and then pretend that we're not changing these important aspects of carbon in all these different pools that John's talking about. The fossil carbon at the bottom, of course, is the petroleum and coal thing that we have traditionally just seen as an energy source, but we've never really spent a lot of time, not as a public and as an engaged public, to understand that there is a way to work with the atmosphere and with the terrestrial landforms through what John's working on. John's not the only one in the world doing this, but he's also doing a Herculean job of bringing it to people's attention at all levels. They've had a lot of success in recent time at the legislative level here in California to bring policy along and to provide what's really the most important, Tara, is some hope and a sense that there's a solution, at least within our grasp, to respond to how we have been treating the carbon cycle, and that we can actually turn this around to in part with the handling of the materials that pass through our hands. So that goes back to materials management, which includes the green waste that comes off of the landscape. It includes the food waste that goes through everybody's homes and systems and bodies every day, and includes the agricultural processes that create all that food. And it's also worth noting that the efficiency of the food system is greatly off by up to some estimates or recent estimates are up to a third of the food in this world is either wasted, or the resources associated with producing that food are not as efficient as they should be, or we are diminishing the capacity of the planet to produce food. And we don't want to go too far down that road, but it would behoove us to reinvent agriculture and our relationship with food, and then the materials that come out of those processes. We're in the well down the road on doing that.
So let me jump in quickly there. We actually
before you go, can you turn off your screen sharing so we can see you? Since we're having the discussion, it would be great.
Okay, I did want to draw one graphic though. One
more.
Great.
Never mind then.
Okay. But to touch on 2 points that Reinhard just made. One, the last thing I read about agricultural production globally, we actually are producing enough food right now to feed 12 billion people. So I think we've got it down in terms of cranking out food. I've been watching population trends, and we've actually over the last couple decades seen a decrease where the planetary population is slowing down. It's not increasing like it had been during the 1900s. So the projection right now is we may top out at 9 billion people. So if we're currently feeding 12 billion, or producing enough food to feed 12 billion people, and the projections are there will be 9 billion, this seems like something we could do to me. And what I wanted to draw next was this idea of agricultural production. It occurs on a continuum. And so in my case, there are different versions of agricultural production. I'm a wild harvester, so I'm going to describe that as WH. There's also input agriculture. So this is row crops. And between these two things is a range of behaviors. So in my system, I don't plant anything, I don't irrigate, I don't fertilize. And that's an important thing. By putting compost back out, we now know that we're simply restoring carbon that was lost through management over the last 200 years. So in our group, we don't think of compost application as fertilization or an amendment. We think of it as actually an effort to restore soil health through managing for carbon. So as a wild harvester, the only thing I do is introduce an herbivory event to remove naturally occurring biomass. Whereas at the high input agricultural end of the continuum, it relies entirely on inputs in terms of water, fertilizer, seed selection, all these different practices. Both of those and everything in between that can be conducted in a way that either enhances the resources or depletes them. And so if we can conduct ourselves on this continuum where we're striving always to enhance the resources through increased production rather than depleting them, we can continue to perform agriculture. And this is really important because in a wild harvest system where I introduce animals, if I overgraze, bringing them at the wrong time, the same exact activity at the wrong time will actually deplete my resources. Whereas when I'm using timing as a tool and introduce this disturbance and the removal of biomass in the right way at the right time, it actually enhances the resources from which it. So that's an aspiration as a land manager. The same thing with input agriculture. We now know that the types of fertilizers and the externalized cost of the Haber-Bosch process fertilizer, there are other forms of nitrogen available, and it turns out that compost is a fascinating form of nitrogen fertilizer. And this is, for me, a fairly recent understanding. Even though I've been in this now for almost a decade, I'm starting to understand more and more in depth. And the molecule that compost is, this carbon-nitrogen complex, is the result of a living process. And so when you start with the feedstocks to make compost, I should back up one click. If we're looking at the different possible amendments someone might topically apply, and not till, we're no more tillage, but just topical applications. These could be synthetic fertilizers, these could be manures, these can be mulches, and they can be composts. And there's a huge difference between all of those, and there's especially big difference between compost and all the others, because when you take the feedstocks to start with, and Reinhart's actually expert on this, but we take a nitrogen form and a carbon form, this is manures and biomass from an agricultural system, for instance, and we combine air and moisture and manage the environment for bacteria to take those feedstocks and build their bodies out of them. That is what composting is. So we're trying to create the ideal conditions for beneficial microbes to take these feedstocks and turn those feedstocks into their bodies and waste products. That's what thermophilic bacteria composting is. And it's wonderful because by doing it that way, this is a living process, and the feedstocks, through being the building blocks of life, there's a regulation that happens in there. The carbon-nitrogen ratio is regulated by the bodies, as is the pH and all the other important factors. So the products coming out of thermophilic bacteria living processes are within a certain boundary, and these are natural boundaries. And when you put those products on soil systems, the soil system knows exactly what to do with it. And this was a very confusing thing for us in our research, because we actually were taking readings of greenhouse gases from the system. And there's a full peer-reviewed published life cycle assessment for this entire research project. The net benefit was tremendously good. What I'm focusing on was that during the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions from the soil system, we did not see any nitrous oxide emissions, and the computer model thought we should. And it turns out that the nitrogen in the compost molecule is actually, the nitrogen and the compost are a complex, and the energy derived to pull that molecule apart is provided by the plant as the plant needs it. So the plant exudes those sugars to feed the microbes, who can then take apart the molecule that is sitting on the soil surface, and then the nitrogen is absorbed and the carbon is taken in at the rate the plant needs it. There's no waste. So these are self-regulated systems, and the uptake is driven by the plant's needs. This is a very exciting thing and totally different.
I'd love to pause you there because we're going to run out of time. We can go a little over the 1 o'clock, but I did want to get to a couple of questions, and if that's okay.
Sure.
Because this series, we're really looking at how do we communicate climate change in new and engaging ways. And I think it's exciting that you're, in a very interesting research capacity, are exploring these links between, ways to capture carbon and also questioning these ideas of consumption of carbon and enjoyment. What was the exact phrasing of carbon? Over-enjoyment of it. And I'm curious on a couple of things because I think one is sometimes in terms of communicating the impacts of something as exciting as this as an opportunity to both, you touched on to have positive impacts on water resources as well as capturing carbon and many other things, and food production. And it sounds like limiting chemical usage as well. How I like to sometimes work backwards and to ask you what's keeping people from instituting this type of work. Is it because it's new in terms of understanding the impacts in terms of climate change? Or is it, are there perhaps other barriers right now in terms of getting more people to scale this?
So I actually, at this point, don't see any barriers, and there's no single point of failure to us actually lowering Earth's temperature right now with what we know. It's a very exciting moment. There's a team working at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab right now on a global circulation model exercise, and they've been doing it for several months. They're about to publish, and my understanding is that that paper is going to basically help people start thinking that we can actually cool the planet. This is a phenomenally important idea. So rather than just reacting to this runaway climate crisis, we now actually know that the natural systems of Earth, with a new understanding and insight, we can actually work with them to cool the planet. That's a great beginning. So how do we do that? And where should we do it? And who should do it? And why should they do it? That's the regionalization of the global circulation model exercise, and that's what we'll be working on next. Meanwhile, there's some basic things that everyone can do. And it's as simple as putting it in the green can. And if everyone just started making sure that anything that comes in their touch ends up in the right place, that's a beginning. It's a behavior. That's the only behavior change I would ask of anyone. And this is why Reinhart's work is so important, because that's the body of their work, is helping people recycle these resources. So I would put it to Reinhart to kind of wrap with actionable items for everyone right now.
Yeah, and Reinhart, because we can go a few minutes over. Because I didn't set an end time for our new chat. Right. I think that it could be interesting as a follow-up in terms of the idea that we started out a little bit of changing our vocabulary from waste to something else. And maybe can you touch a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. The idea is that to re-understand our interrelationship, not just with the living systems, but with the things that we decide we want to bring into our lives, which include all the products, including this computer that we're all working on. We make decisions like that all the time. We are empowered to make those decisions, and the impacts of how and where and what we do with the materials that pass through our hands is increasingly important. To go a different direction, we need to stop impacting the ocean with the materials that come through our hands. We need to prevent that. But with the green waste and the food waste, we can have a positive impact. So public education is absolute must. And then understanding that in the living systems, there really isn't a sense of waste, because things recycle, especially organic materials, and in the case of grasslands, in a much quicker time frame. One of the things that John didn't really touch on too much is that grasslands are much more responsive than forested lands or jungle or rainforests or similar, so that grasslands can be stimulated to be photosynthetically effective in a much shorter time frame. Going back to the materials that we have at hand, repurposing those as opposed to calling them waste is vital. Recycling is not a tired term, but it's also kind of run its course for the time being. We need to enlarge the conversation about how we consume on this planet, because one of our friends from Maggie's group, Alicia, just came up with the simplest and most useful term, which is there is no away in a closed system. So that's true of the waste materials, but it's also true of greenhouse gases. So if we treat carbon poorly and then expect it to go away, it doesn't go away, it accumulates. And that's part of the broader education thing that I'm really interested in, and I think that can be simplified. You want to have the elevator pitch. Well, one of them, that's a beautiful elevator pitch, is to understand that what we do really doesn't, even if it goes out of sight, that doesn't mean that it actually disappeared. We need to handle those materials and have a holistic and sustainable approach to almost everything that we do. We're in the process of doing that, but we're very clever that way. We need to be more clever that way. We need to realize this at scale, and then educate the public so that they understand that. There's been a tremendous boom in consumption in my lifetime, in your lifetime. Have we understood the consequences of all that? Well, we're rounding into shape, but we have yet to implement a lot of things. Going back to the question about barriers, when you look at agriculture, there have been ways of doing things that people learn, and then they say, well, this is how we do things. There's no reason that we can't emancipate some people from some of these hardened positions about how things are done. I think we can really learn and relearn and reappreciate the living systems that we work within and how to work with them, and to ensure that our behavior is in line with those systems. In Berkeley, there are a lot of brilliant people. One of the most brilliant people about this is Fritjof Capra, who has spoken so eloquently and at length about understanding and working within living systems and treating them accordingly, and then designing our human behavior and our as many processes as we can to be in line with those living systems. So that's systems theory. So it's a complicated book, but it's not a complicated thought. And so going back to what John does, his beautiful work is a fraction of systems theory, and then understanding the carbon cycle and using it to our benefit. Great.
And another follow-up, I would say, do you guys have a couple more minutes just for a little conversation?
Sure.
John, great. So I'm in New York City right now, and there aren't a lot of grasslands around, and you know, there's maybe a bit of a disconnect there. You know, a lot of people don't even have access to soil. And so how would you adapt this into something actionable for people living in urban environments?
So may I? Yeah, so to start with, do you eat? Okay? You already have an intimate relationship with the carbon cycle. You are 16% carbon. Carbon is good. Carbon is essential for life. But in terms of the urban experience, it turns out, and this was fairly recent, a recent understanding for me, guess what the single largest irrigated crop in America is? It's lawns. So there we are. We have this intact, highly managed, highly fertilized, highly watered system under our immediate control. It's all around us, even in the urban environment. And this has been one of the more recent developments that we've integrated into the Comet Planner, is looking at lawn and turf as a crop under the pasture category. And that's not finished yet, but we're hoping it comes out soon. That will help people understand that everything around them is actually an opportunity. So in addition to putting it in the green can to get it into the compost stream, the choices you make about the fiber you wear, the food you eat, the fuel you enjoy, as we put more and more interest and importance on where those things come from and the consequences of those choices, the more comfortable the more comfortable we will be enjoying decisions that we know that every single action of ours can actually make this planet a better place. So the food you enjoy, the fuel you enjoy, the fiber you wear. And I really would encourage people to go to the Fiber Shed website and explore that. That's a huge conversation that we should be having. The microfibers that we all enjoy in our performance sport wear, when you wash that garment, the microfibers that come off of it, at least in the Northern European system, are now going out and coating the ocean floor with saran wrap effectively. So our intimate decisions about the microfibers, the performance sportwear, the fossil fuel derived textiles, the pigments. It takes 400 pounds of coal tar to make 1 pound of blue pigment for our indigo blue jeans. This is all mined, extracted. There's a plant called indigo that actually makes a beautiful blue pigment. So the more of the blue we enjoy that's derived from carbon farm derived indigo plants, the more carbon we remove from the atmosphere, and also create a beautiful non-toxic pigment to enjoy blue, because the blue is a very nice color.
Right. So to try and dial in on what you're saying, I've spent plenty of time in New York, not as much as I'd like to, but I sure love it. And I understand that it is a deeply urban environment, and that a direct connection day to day with grasslands, rangelands, or all kinds of things is not really accessible. But what John is saying is it's true. We all eat, we all wear clothes, and that those buying choices and the consumption choices are critical to driving markets and developing sustainable procedures outside of the urban environment. So in the sense, what can people do? That's a big part of it.
Yeah, and I would say, unfortunately, the lawns don't connect much here in New York. There aren't many lawns here, but certainly consumer choices are huge. And I think maybe a closing that could be interesting, if you're open to it, is how can we be informed consumers? When I go to the grocery store, it doesn't tell me the environmental or social impacts of the things that I'm buying. And there certainly are some good websites out there, but there aren't one-stop shops for many things, and it can be difficult to be an informed consumer, particularly with more complex systems like the type of work you're doing, John. So do you have any resources for the how?
Yeah, it's very simple, actually, and I've enjoyed the success of this approach through a simple thing called asking a question. And so right now, we started this campaign in California called carbon farming. And it's a new idea. It's based on the NRC's practice list. And during our presentations and going out working, that question comes up. And so the reply is, ask your local resource conservation district for a carbon farm plan. Nobody knew what we were talking about, but across the state, there have been more and more and more inquiries into what is a carbon farm plan. We are now rolling out a statewide carbon farm plan program, and there's money in the budget and healthy soils. It all worked. It started with a chorus of questions. So in terms of consumers and all of us, ask the question, is this product climate beneficial? At first, no one will know what you're talking about. But soon, across the country, if everybody keeps asking that question, I know that retailers are very interested in this idea. I'm working with a group right now, and they believe that by consumer pressure, we could shift the production mode. And it starts with consumer inquiry. Is this climate beneficial? Just start with that. People will have no idea what you're talking about, but if we keep asking it, it suggests several things: that it could be climate beneficial, what is climate beneficial, and it will start a conversation. That's my ask.
There we go. Just an analogy would be the nutrition information on the food that we all get, and it breaks it down into carbohydrates and calories and all this stuff. That wasn't in existence prior to public interest in the health of the materials that they ate. We're not going to be able to get a climate diagram on materials as yet, but as John says, we're going to drive the process by our curiosity and our insistence on being in line with climate beneficial practices. So that is imminent, but not immediate. So we will do that. The public demands it. And if I could sum up what John's work does for me and for other people, is that it does offer a response in the hopeful category that we can manage these things, rather than to say we don't really have a response to this increased carbon. And one more thing, if I could, carbon has taken on kind of a dark image as a word. Carbon is part of a cycle. Carbon dioxide is a gas. We need to keep educating people that it isn't just carbon that's a problem. It's carbon as CO2 in the atmosphere and in the oceans. So there's major educational challenges ahead, but it's also possible to simplify it a little bit. So trying to nail down what you were just saying, how do people make choices? Well, demanding definitions of what the materials are and whether they're climate beneficial is going to be part of what we need to do going forward. So curiosity is a big thing.
It is. And gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for sticking with us through the technical difficulties over a couple different days. We finally did it.
Right.
And this is really interesting, and I'd love to see some citizen science, around experimenting in urban areas around the work you're doing, John. So that might be another conversation we can have. And thank you so much. And we will have one more talk in the series. We're waiting to confirm our final guest, but we'll let you know. And thank you guys so much. I hope the rest of your day goes wonderful and your event later today.
Thank you so much, Jared. We really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day. Bye.
Cheers.